Imagine a life of power, fear, and betrayal, ending with a violent death in a prison cell. This is the true story of James Whitey Bulger, once one of the most feared mobsters in America. From orchestrating murders to evading the FBI for 16 years, Bulger's criminal empire seemed unstoppable. But even the most powerful have to face their reckoning. What led to his savage end in 2018? The early morning hours of October 30th, 2018, marked the brutal end of one of America's most infamous mobsters. At 6 a.m., James Whitey Bulger, now an old man of 89, sat quietly in his wheelchair inside his prison cell. The door had just been unlocked for breakfast when three men began making their way toward him. Bulger wouldn't live to see another sunrise or tell his version of the story. The men approaching him were far from ordinary inmates. Among them was Fotis Freddie Hayes, a feared mafia enforcer from Massachusetts who was already serving a life sentence for 2 gang-related murders. Alongside Hayes was Paul DeCalogero, a member of a notorious Massachusetts gang, with a dark past that included the murder of a teenage girl. The gang believed she knew too much, and DeCalogero was serving out the final 4 years of a 25-year sentence for his role in that crime. The third man, Sean McKinnon, was a small-time criminal who seemed to be along for the ride. But how did Whitey Bulger, a once powerful figure in the criminal underworld, now a feeble old man, find himself in such a perilous position, awaiting a violent death? To unravel this, we must go far beyond the simple label of mobster. Bulger's life was filled with extraordinary and shocking twists. He had served time in the infamous Alcatraz prison, been a test subject in the CIA's covert MKUltra experiments, and at one point, had ranked as the FBI's second most wanted man, right behind Osama bin Laden himself. But before we delve into his final days, let's rewind a bit and revisit the story of Whitey Bulger, a tale filled with betrayal, power, and an inevitable downfall that began long before his death. James Joseph Bulger, who would later be notoriously known as Whitey, entered the world on September 3, 1929, in the heart of Boston. He was the son of hard-working Irish immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life. Bulger's father, a union laborer, took whatever jobs he could find, often working as a longshoreman at the busy Boston docks. However, tragedy struck when his father lost an arm in a devastating industrial accident. The consequences of this misfortune plunged the Bulger family into deep poverty, forever altering the course of their lives. In 1938, as part of a government initiative to address housing needs for the poor, the Mary Ellen McCormick Housing Project opened its doors in South Boston. The Bulger family, struggling to make ends meet, moved into this public housing complex, and it was within the streets and shadows of South Boston that James Bulger would truly begin his infamous journey. From an early age, it became clear that James and his brother William were destined for very different paths. William Bulger excelled in school, a model student who would later rise to become a respected figure in politics. James, on the other hand, found himself irresistibly drawn to the rough and unforgiving life of the streets. By the time he was just 13, he had already experienced his first arrest. Juvenile delinquency became the pattern for the troubled young boy. It started small, with petty crimes like shoplifting and stealing from delivery trucks. But soon, young James would venture into darker territory. One of his particularly cruel pastimes involved luring homosexual men, only to rob and viciously beat them afterward. It was around this period that he acquired the infamous nickname Whitey, given to him because of his striking white blonde hair. Though Whitey despised the moniker, preferring to be called Jim, or even Boots, a nod to the cowboy boots he wore that concealed a hidden switchblade, the nickname stuck. And it's Whitey Bulger, not Boots Bulger, that history would come to remember. During this time, fate intervened in a way that would have profound consequences for both Whitey and another young boy, John Connolly. In a seemingly innocent moment, 19-year-old Bulger bought 8-year-old Connolly an ice cream, and later stepped in to defend the boy from an older attacker, telling the bully to go pick on someone your own size. Little did either of them know that this small act of kindness would spark a relationship that would change the trajectory of their lives and the future of organized crime in Boston. By 1956, Whitey Bulger's criminal career had escalated to a series of daring bank robberies across multiple states. The law finally caught up to him, and he was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. It was during this prison term that Bulger's story took an even darker turn. Desperate to reduce his sentence, Whitey volunteered to participate in a series of experimental programs being conducted on prisoners. What he didn't fully realize at the time was that he had unwittingly signed up to become a human guinea pig in one of the most infamous secret experiments in U.S. history, the CIA's MKUltra program. This covert and highly illegal initiative aimed to explore mind control techniques using a range of disturbing methods, including the administration of psychoactive drugs like LSD, as well as sensory deprivation and even psychological torture. Participants were subjected to high doses of hallucinogens and put through horrific procedures that aimed to break down their mental and emotional defenses. The MKUltra program was designed to develop methods of controlling human behavior, whether through drug-induced confessions, brainwashing, or weakening the mind through extreme psychological manipulation. Though it officially began in 1953, the program continued in the shadows for 2 decades, wreaking havoc on the lives of countless individuals. For Whitey, the psychological toll of these experiments was profound. Some speculate that his time as a subject in the MKUltra trials only deepened his violent tendencies and helped shape him into the cold, calculating figure he would later become. It's chilling to imagine the impact such a brutal program could have had on an already dangerous man. That Whitey voluntarily submitted himself to such extreme measures reveals a hunger for freedom at any cost, but at what price to his mind and soul? The twisted experiments of MKUltra marked a pivotal point in Whitey Bulger's life, blending the brutal world of crime with a new, even more sinister layer of psychological damage. His journey from a delinquent street thug to one of the most feared and infamous mobsters in America was far from over, but it was already clear that he was no ordinary criminal. What lay ahead for Whitey Bulger was a dark and violent path that would entangle him in both organized crime and government conspiracies. Bulger's time as part of the MKUltra program left scars that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He described the experience as nothing short of a living nightmare, dragging him to the very edges of sanity. The psychological torment he endured was so severe that he feared sharing the full details with anyone, believing that if he did, he might end up permanently confined to a mental institution. The trauma of those experiments lingered, shaping the man he would become, though Bulger rarely spoke of it. In 1959, Bulger found himself transferred to one of America's most notorious prisons, Alcatraz. Even in the grim world of hardened criminals, Alcatraz stood apart, a fortress for society's most dangerous men. Bulger's stay there was brief, but it significantly bolstered his reputation. When he was eventually paroled in 1965, after stops at other penitentiaries, it would mark the last time Bulger would spend in prison for the next 46 years. During this long stretch of freedom, Whitey Bulger would rise to the pinnacle of Boston's criminal underworld. Upon returning to Boston, he quickly discovered that his time in Alcatraz had turned him into something of a legend. The stories of his prison years added a dark mystique to his name, making him both feared and respected on the streets. In the early 1970s, Bulger found his place in the Winter Hill Gang, a predominantly Irish-American crime syndicate. He started as an enforcer, using his ruthless demeanor and street smarts to climb through the ranks, solidifying his position in the city's criminal landscape. In 1975, a significant turning point in Bulger's life occurred. He struck a deal with the FBI that would forever change the trajectory of his criminal career. Officially classified as a top-echelon informant, Bulger agreed to provide the FBI with valuable information about his competitors, specifically the Italian Mafia, in exchange for protection. The deal's true irony lay in the fact that Bulger's FBI handler was none other than John Connolly, the very boy he had once saved on the streets of South Boston. Now, as adults, their relationship took on a twisted and corrupt form that would later become infamous as one of the biggest scandals in the history of the FBI. The relationship between Bulger and Connolly became what some have called a devil's deal. While Bulger funneled information about his rivals to the FBI, Connolly, in return, made sure the Bureau turned a blind eye to Bulger's own criminal activities. It was an agreement that allowed Whitey to continue expanding his power in Boston without fear of law enforcement interference. Despite the evidence that pointed to Bulger's role as an informant, he spent his entire life vehemently denying that he ever cooperated with the authorities. If you were to ask Bulger, he would tell you that he never cracked. Never, never. In his mind, he wasn't a snitch, but rather the puppeteer pulling the strings. He would readily admit to the secret meetings with Connolly, but in Bulger's version of events, he was the one in control. "I was the guy who did the directing. They didn't direct me," he would claim, painting himself as the mastermind who manipulated the FBI for his own benefit. The late 1970s were a pivotal time for Bulger. In 1979, a scandal involving race fixing landed both the boss and deputy of the Winter Hill Gang behind bars. With the leadership in disarray, Bulger saw an opportunity and seized it. Thanks to Connolly's protection, Whitey managed to evade prosecution himself and stepped into the role of leader of the gang. Under his reign, the Winter Hill Gang thrived, with Bulger steering its operations with a combination of brutality and calculated intelligence. Bulger's relationship with Connolly became a powerful tool during his reign. Connolly provided him with information about law enforcement investigations, tipping him off to potential threats and allowing Bulger to stay one step ahead of the authorities. This symbiotic relationship grew so strong that Connolly even turned a blind eye to murders committed by Bulger and his crew. With Connolly as his ally on the inside, Bulger had effectively placed himself above the law, free to continue his violent rise without consequence. The protection Whitey received from the FBI allowed him to operate with impunity for years, his empire growing unchecked while law enforcement unknowingly aided in his success. It was a chilling arrangement. A government agency tasked with upholding the law had, in fact, become an enabler of one of the most dangerous criminals in American history. But as we know, no deal with the devil comes without a cost, and eventually, the truth behind Bulger's double life would come to light. By 1994, Whitey Bulger's luck had finally run out. After years of operating with apparent immunity, the authorities were closing in on him. A joint task force involving the DEA, the Boston Police, and the Massachusetts State Police had painstakingly built a rock-solid case against him. The FBI, once his ally through his corrupt relationship with Agent John Connolly, had been excluded from the operation due to concerns that they were compromised. The hammer of justice was about to fall, and arrests were imminent. But Bulger was not a man to go quietly. In a final, desperate move, he reportedly called John Morris, Connolly's FBI supervisor, and delivered a chilling message: "If I'm going to jail, you're going to jail. I'm taking you with me." The sheer terror Bulger inspired was so great that Morris soon suffered a heart attack, a stark reminder of Whitey's pervasive influence and the deadly reach of his threats. In December of that same year, with the authorities closing in, Connolly performed one last favor for his childhood friend. He warned Whitey about the coming indictment, and Bulger immediately fled Boston. While his closest associates in the Winter Hill Gang were swiftly arrested, Bulger embarked on a 16-year run from the law, becoming a legendary figure of criminal folklore in the process. Despite the intense manhunt that followed, Whitey Bulger proved to be an elusive ghost. The first confirmed sighting of him came in 2002, when a businessman in London crossed paths with Bulger. Only later, while watching the film Hannibal and seeing a detective scan the FBI's most wanted list, did the businessman realize who he had encountered. Other potential sightings trickled in from around the world, some more credible than others. In 2007, video footage from Sicily showed a couple resembling Bulger and his girlfriend Catherine Gregg, but they were later identified as German tourists. Even the FBI was sent chasing leads to places as far as Uruguay, hoping to track him down. The lengths the authorities went to in their search were extraordinary. In 2010, the FBI, knowing Bulger was an avid reader, scoured bookstores on Vancouver Island, distributing wanted posters and questioning employees. They even staked out military history events, suspecting that Bulger's love for historical battles, particularly D-Day, might lure him to such gatherings. Meanwhile, digital technology was employed to generate aged images of what Bulger might look like in the 21st century. Yet, all along, Bulger had been hiding in plain sight. He was living under the alias Charlie Gasco in a quiet seaside apartment in Santa Monica, California, with Catherine Gregg, who went by the name Carol. Far from leading a life of constant fear or elaborate disguise, Whitey and Gregg blended into the local community. They were a polite, if somewhat secretive, couple. Neighbors noted that they were friendly enough, even helping carry groceries at times, but they were the type of people you couldn't call directly. Their phone number was kept private. Bulger, despite being the second most wanted man in the world, even made occasional public appearances at the Santa Monica Pier. There were moments of near exposure during these years. In 2008, one man claimed to have spotted Bulger on the pier, shirtless and reading a book, and immediately called America's Most Wanted. Another witness reported seeing Bulger that same year while on vacation. Yet, somehow, these sightings failed to lead to his capture. The most audacious moment during his time on the run came shortly after he had fled Boston. In an almost mocking gesture, Bulger visited Alcatraz, the same prison where he had once served time, not as an inmate, but as a tourist. With his then-girlfriend Teresa Stanley, they posed for photos in mock prison uniforms outside the Rock. This was just one of several vacation snapshots, part of an album documenting their travels through Paris, London's Tower of London, and other European landmarks, all while Bulger remained a fugitive. Despite all the resources spent on tracking him, and the near misses, it wasn't high-tech surveillance or global manhunts that finally brought Whitey Bulger down. In the end, it was a former Miss Iceland who tipped the scales. Anna Bjornsdottir had lived next door to Bulger and Gregg, though she knew them as the Gascos, and recognized them from a 30-second FBI TV ad aimed at daytime television viewers. The ad featured photos of Bulger and Gregg from the 1990s, and when Bjornsdottir made the connection, she picked up the phone. That simple call brought an end to the 16-year pursuit of one of America's most notorious criminals. Bjornsdottir collected a cool $2 million for the tip that ended Bulger's reign. The FBI strategy had been deliberate in featuring Gregg prominently in the ad. They believed that finding her would lead them to Bulger, and that's exactly what happened. On June 22, 2011, law enforcement officers surrounded the Santa Monica apartment. Accounts of the arrest vary, but one claim states that when the officers burst in, Bulger, ever defiant, simply rolled his eyes and said, "I ain't getting down on my knees." In 2013, Bulger stood trial for an array of crimes, including 32 counts of racketeering and firearms possession. Most damning of all were the allegations that he was directly involved in 19 murders. On August 12, 2013, the jury found him guilty on 31 of the 32 charges and held him accountable for 11 killings. A few months later, on November 14, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 5 years. Despite the decades of evasion and his carefully constructed image of invincibility, Whitey Bulger's life came to a close in a federal prison. His capture, trial, and ultimate sentencing were a stark reminder that even the most legendary criminals eventually meet their downfall. The United States Penitentiary Coleman II, located in Central Florida, had long held a reputation for being a sanctuary for the most vulnerable in the federal prison system, marked men. These were inmates guilty of the kinds of activities that earned them targets on their backs even within the brutal, unwritten codes of the criminal underworld, snitches, informants, and those who had betrayed their own kind. In this dangerous hierarchy, being a government informant ranked among the worst of offenses. And yet, at Coleman II, they were said to be safe. One GED teacher at the prison quipped, "We have a lot of snitches here, but they're safe." It's like the old saying, among thieves, there's honor. So it made perfect sense that this is where James Whitey Bulger, notorious mob boss and informant, was placed after his capture and conviction. He was kept there, supposedly under the radar, insulated from the threats that came with his past. That is, until October 2018, when things began to spiral. For reasons that have sparked countless questions and suspicions, Bulger was suddenly bounced from facility to facility within a matter of weeks. His final stop? The United States Penitentiary Hazelton in West Virginia, a prison known for its extreme violence. Nicknamed Misery Mountain, Hazelton was no place for a high-profile prisoner like Bulger, especially given his history as an informant. In fact, it was infamous for prisoner homicides, with Bulger's being the third in just 40 days. Before his ill-fated transfer, even the warden at Coleman had gone to great lengths to protect him. He kept Bulger isolated from the general population for 6 months, consulting with the most powerful inmates to ensure no one would make a move on the aging mobster. "He's an old guy," the warden said, "but gangsters don't forget." And yet, despite all that effort to keep Bulger safe, Hazelton would prove to be a fatal relocation. On the night of October 29, 2018, Whitey Bulger was transferred from the Federal Transfer Center in Oklahoma City to Hazelton, where he was dropped into the general prison population, like a lamb among wolves. He lasted only a few hours. By 6:06 a.m. on October 30th, the inevitable unfolded. 3 men, Freddie Hayes, a feared mafia enforcer, Paul DeCalagero, a ruthless member of a Massachusetts gang, and Sean McKinnon, a low-level criminal, reached Bulger's cell. While McKinnon played lookout, Hayes and DeCalagero entered the cell. Armed with a padlock wrapped in a sock, they savagely beat the defenseless Bulger. They also carried a shiv, using it to brutally maim him. His eyes were nearly gouged out, and his tongue was almost severed, a symbolic act reserved for rats in the criminal world. The assault was over in 7 minutes, leaving Bulger's body so mangled that he was described as unrecognizable by law enforcement officials. It was a gruesome end, but shockingly, no one was surprised. The moment Bulger was transferred to Hazelton, it was almost as if his fate had been sealed. The obvious question on everyone's mind was, why? Why was Whitey Bulger, a notorious informant and marked man, transferred from a facility like Coleman, where he was relatively safe, to Hazelton, a prison with a violent reputation and a recent history of prisoner murders? On the surface, there seemed to be only 2 possible explanations. Either it was sheer incompetence on the part of the authorities, or it was by design. The official reason provided for his transfer was medical. According to prison documents obtained by NBC News, officials stated that Bulger's health had improved enough to warrant his transfer to the general population. The paperwork indicated that he had completed treatment at a medical facility and was in stable condition. But this explanation quickly crumbled under scrutiny. First, other prison records contradicted the claim that he had been in a medical facility. They revealed that Bulger had actually been in solitary confinement, not receiving treatment, in the time leading up to his transfer. Second, the notion of Bulger being in good health was a stretch at best. In letters sent to a California woman he corresponded with, Bulger detailed his deteriorating condition. He described suffering from a string of health problems, including 8 heart attacks. Just before his transfer, while still at Coleman, Bulger experienced severe chest pains and was examined by a nurse who recommended he be seen by an outside cardiologist due to his worsening condition. So if the official reason didn't hold up, what was the real motive behind his transfer? Was it simple bureaucratic failure, a colossal oversight by the system, or was something more sinister at play? Was Bulger's violent end orchestrated by higher powers, an act of revenge, or a way to silence him once and for all? After all, he carried with him decades' worth of secrets about his criminal enterprise and his corrupt dealings with law enforcement, particularly his years-long relationship with FBI agents like John Connolly. Whatever the reason, Bulger's death at Hazelton was not an accident. It was the final chapter in a life marked by violence, betrayal, and relentless ambition. It was almost poetic in its brutality, an informant who lived his life by exploiting others, meeting his end at the hands of those who would never forgive him for it. The man who once manipulated the FBI to stay on top, who evaded capture for 16 years, and who mocked his pursuers with holiday snaps at Alcatraz, was ultimately reduced to a victim of the very world he had dominated for so long. The story of James Whitey Bulger doesn't end with a peaceful fade into obscurity, but with a violent crescendo, a fate he had seemingly outrun for decades, but that, in the end, caught up with him in the most merciless of ways. And above all, this explanation completely fails to address the most glaring issue of all: how could anyone have overlooked the obvious and overwhelming threat to Bulger's life? Regardless of whether his health had supposedly improved, the real question was whether he was going to be murdered the moment he stepped into the general population. The fact that he was a notorious informant, a rat in the eyes of the criminal underworld, meant that his physical health was secondary to the more immediate danger. For Bulger, the mere act of walking into a prison populated by violent inmates was effectively a death sentence. Could such a monumental mistake really be chalked up to simple incompetence? Cameron Lindsay, a retired warden who had overseen 3 federal facilities, called the case a shocking failure on multiple levels. He didn't mince words when he stated, "There's absolutely no way Bulger should have been sent to Hazelton, and he sure as heck should never have been released to the general population there." It's hard to imagine how so many people could have dropped the ball on this thing. Lindsay's analysis points to a failure in the system, but even he couldn't help but express confusion. How could such a colossal oversight happen? Was it really just incompetence, or was something more deliberate at play? For Vito Maraviglia, a former federal prison special investigative agent with 27 years of experience monitoring high-risk inmates, the situation seemed even more clear-cut. He didn't dance around the issue. "It looks like they gave him the death sentence," Maraviglia said bluntly. He went on to add, "For anyone to say I didn't know he'd get hurt there is a flat-out lie. Either they were grossly negligent or just complete idiots, and there had to be at least 10 idiots, because a lot of people signed off on this." Despite mounting questions, the Federal Bureau of Prisons has remained tight-lipped. When pressed for answers, they provided a generic statement, saying, "For safety and security reasons, we do not discuss specific conditions of confinement or an inmate's disciplinary history. We cannot comment further due to an ongoing investigation." This response did little to quell suspicions and left many wondering how Bulger's death could have occurred under such circumstances. In the federal prison system, moving inmates between facilities is routine. Transfers can happen for a variety of reasons, and approval typically flows through a centralized unit in Texas, as well as regional offices involved in the relocation. But moving an inmate like Whitey Bulger, an 89-year-old convicted mobster with a violent past and a history of being an FBI informant, was far from ordinary. Prison staff members familiar with the process confirmed that Bulger's transfer would have been initiated by the warden at Coleman II, the facility where he had been held previously. After making its way through the bureaucratic layers of the federal prison system, the final decision would have landed on the desk of Hazelton's warden. There was no mystery about who James Whitey Bulger was. His intake form at Hazelton explicitly labeled him as a Boston mobster involved in numerous murders and acts of violence. High-profile case. His threat level was marked as greatest. Lindsay pointed out that the Hazelton warden and staff bore ultimate responsibility for deciding whether or not Bulger should have been placed in general population, unless, of course, they had been ordered to do so by someone higher up in the chain of command. This leads to the darker theory: was Bulger's transfer to Hazelton an intentional setup designed to ensure his murder? According to Sean McKinnon, the inmate who acted as a lookout during Bulger's murder, everybody knew he was coming. McKinnon was quick to emphasize that this wasn't some insider knowledge. He heard it from just another inmate, not even one from Massachusetts. The information was common knowledge in the prison, a fact underscored by a recorded phone call McKinnon made to his mother just 5 hours before Bulger's arrival at Hazelton. "You should know the name. White Bulger," he told her. "Oh Jesus, stay away from him, please," she replied, to which McKinnon ominously responded, I can't." Officials have yet to provide an explanation for how inmates knew Bulger was coming. But by 5 a.m. on the morning of Bulger's murder, surveillance cameras caught Hayes, McKinnon, and DeCalagero meeting together in their cell. They were already planning the attack. Later, Hayes and DeCalagero admitted to another inmate that they were the ones who killed Bulger, citing his reputation as a snitch. DeCalagero reportedly told the inmate that as soon as they saw Bulger enter the unit, they made the decision to kill him. For those in the criminal world, killing Whitey Bulger was more than just murder, it was a badge of honor. According to an anonymous law enforcement source, he's a rich man now. He'll run any prison he's in. Hayes, especially, was seen as a criminal hero for orchestrating the murder of such a high-profile informant. Admission of guilt wasn't the problem. In fact, it only solidified the killer's status within the criminal hierarchy. So, was this all part of a bigger design? Criminal involvement is undeniable, but the lingering question remains, was Bulger's death orchestrated by forces beyond the prison walls? Were the inmates merely the hands used to carry out a plot devised by someone higher up the chain? Some speculate that Bulger's extensive knowledge of government corruption and FBI collusion might have made him too dangerous to keep alive. On the second anniversary of Bulger's murder, his family filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, and the U.S. Marshals Service. The suit, which sought $200 million in damages, alleged that there was a government conspiracy to intentionally harm Bulger. Attorneys Hank Brennan and David Schoen left no ambiguity in their letter to the Department of Justice. To be clear, we do not believe that the transfer to FCI Hazelton and placement in the general population was simply dangerous, negligent, reckless, and irresponsible, they wrote. We believe it was also intentional and part of a conspiracy among BOP, DOJ employees, and others to intentionally cause Mr. Bulger's serious injuries and death. The family's statement echoed these claims. We believe that James Bulger was deliberately placed in harm's way. There is simply no other explanation for the transfer of someone in his condition and inmate status to be placed in the general population of one of the country's most violent federal penitentiaries. In January 2022, the lawsuit was dismissed. However, it wasn't dismissed due to lack of evidence, but rather because a U.S. district judge ruled that federal courts were prohibited by Congress from weighing in on prison housing decisions that led to injury or death. In other words, the court didn't examine the claims of a conspiracy, it was prevented from doing so. Bulger's attorney, Brennan, has since claimed that the Justice Department deliberately waited to file charges against his killers until after the civil suit had been thrown out. Had the charges been filed earlier, Brennan argued, it might have forced the government to hand over additional evidence that could have helped the family's case. In the end, Whitey Bulger's death remains shrouded in suspicion. Was it a tragic failure of the prison system, or was it something far more calculated? The truth may never fully come to light, but one thing is certain, for a man who built a life on betrayal, violence, and manipulation, his violent end feels eerily fitting, a final, brutal chapter in the saga of James Whitey Bulger. Brennan has made it clear that he believes the government intentionally withheld key information regarding Whitey Bulger's transfer to Hazelton, stating that they knew that a civil lawsuit could not proceed unless we knew who signed the transfer order, who directed it, and who approved putting him in a place where everybody knew he would be murdered. His words underscore a deep mistrust in the system, further emphasizing that they just don't want this information to go to the public. And they don't want to prosecute their own, and they never will. In response to Brennan's accusations, a spokesperson for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Virginia flatly rejected his claims. They insisted that the civil case brought by Bulger's family had no bearing on the criminal investigation or the timing of the indictment. Yet, despite the official denial, questions remain. One curious and deeply perplexing detail lingers in the aftermath of Bulger's death. According to the intake screening form Bulger filled out, when asked if there were any reasons he should be kept out of the general population, he answered no. This is astonishing, given that Bulger, more than anyone, knew the full extent of the threat against his life. Was he under the delusion that somehow, even in a prison known for its violence, he would receive protection? Was it a sign of cognitive decline, perhaps dementia or Alzheimer's, leaving him unaware of the gravity of what he was signing? Or was it something deeper, a final act of defiance from a man who had spent his entire life denying he was a rat, even as his body failed him, his health deteriorated, and his freedom was taken away? Maybe it was indifference, or even a resignation to his fate, knowing that, at 89 years old, in a wheelchair, despised by the criminal world he once ruled, death was inevitable. Some, like the former warden Ed Coleman, believe Bulger wanted to die. The warden suggested that Bulger had come to terms with his life and its violent consequences, pointing to the incident where Bulger experienced severe chest pains during an exam and the nurse recommended he see a heart specialist. Rather than accept the advice, Bulger threatened her, claiming, "I know people. I still have connections back home." This outburst, the warden speculated, set in motion his fateful transfer to Hazelton, sealing his tragic end. Bulger's funeral, a modest and somber affair, was attended only by a small group of family members, including his brother William, once the Massachusetts State Senate President, and Catherine Gregg's twin sister. Outside of this intimate gathering, however, there was an outpouring of reaction, but not one of grief. It was more of a collective exhalation, as if those who had suffered at Bulger's hands were finally freed from the weight of his long shadow. Stephen Davis, whose sister Deborah was reportedly killed by Bulger in 1981, encapsulated the feelings of many when he said, "He died the way I always hoped he would die." His words reflected the bitter satisfaction that Bulger's violent end had brought some small measure of closure. Carmen Ortiz, the former U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts who oversaw Bulger's prosecution, shared this sentiment, adding, "It's just sad that it took so long." Tommy Donahue, whose father Michael was gunned down by Bulger in 1982 in a botched hit meant for someone else, went even further. He declared that if he could, he would put money in the guy's canteen, whoever killed him, and took grim pleasure in the thought that Bulger would spend eternity getting a pitchfork in the ass from the devil himself. Rachel Rollins, another former U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, saw Bulger's death as a bitterly ironic turn of events. She remarked that, in the cruelest twist, Bulger's family had now endured the same excruciating pain and trauma that Bulger himself had inflicted on so many others. Perhaps the most fitting reaction came from yet another former U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts, who simply stated, "We received word this morning about the death of James Whitey Bulger. Our thoughts are with his victims and their families." It was a stark, unsentimental acknowledgement of Bulger's passing, and a reminder that even in death, Bulger remained a symbol of the pain he had caused to so many. There's a sense of kicking a dead horse in all these reactions, but it's fully deserved. Whitey Bulger was a man who had left a trail of destruction in his wake, and in the end, the world showed little sympathy for him. His death wasn't mourned by the masses, but rather seen as the long overdue conclusion to a life built on betrayal, violence, and exploitation. For many, his murder wasn't a tragedy, it was justice, delivered too late but still welcomed by those whose lives he had shattered.